Hi, thanks for being here today. This is a really nice turnout. And I'm here to introduce Allison Wickham. She is from the Siller Pollinator Company. She established it in 2019, and she's known from many clients as the Bee Lady. Yay. Allison has a scientific education and a diverse background in agricultural related industries. She brings in-depth knowledge on beekeeping and pollinator habitat management. So what she's going to do too is she brought her pollinators' favorite plant list, so we can, learn about that, as well as information on some common pollinators for your garden in your garden. She's going to discuss the pressures which are detrimental to pollinator populations, as well as the way to reverse it, so that the decline in that population, maybe we can help, and that's what this is all about. How can we help? She's going to let us know about that. We do have free handouts, and we do have her list there, and if you don't get one, just let me know. I'll send it to you by email. Okay? We also, as the Wildlife Committee, are trying to do this program for Lake Monticello that they've approved for gardening for wildlife, and Allison can really help us with this and make it personal, but also make it as a group here to do what we can to make our yards a little bit more, habitat friendly for the pollinators. And so also I want to give this bee thing as a thank you.
That's so cute.
For Allison for bringing all her things and just making this a nice program for us to learn so much more during the time we need to. But I'm going to give it to Allison now. And thank you.
Thank you so much.
So I went to JMU. Go Dukes. I'm from Powhatan. I remember the first stoplight in Powhatan, so it's changed a lot. And when you graduate from college, there's a grace year before the student loan people want your money back. And so I just booked a one-way flight to Hawaii because why not? I had the money for the ticket. And when I got there, I got a job on a farm, and I said, what do you want me to do today? And they said, put a bee suit on and go look at the honeybees. So that was I think 12 years ago or something, and I just have not stopped from that moment on. Every day, it's been more and more and more, deeper into this. And I like to joke that I work 100 hours. Well, it's not a joke that I work 100 hours a week, but I like to joke that means that my experience is double of what I actually have, because I've been doing it continuously all day, every day since then. And what started as a honeybee passion opened my eyes to the world of everybody else, all the rest of the pollinators that are out there, and how in trouble they are, and how some of it's directly our fault, and some of it's not. And we can help, and we can do something about it. And not only can we help and do something about it, but it's beautiful and fun. So it's not awful and boring like giving things up. It's adding more to your life and being helpful. So it's this beautiful thing that we can all do, and I just, my whole life, have hated my bosses so much. And that wasn't their fault, it was my fault. But I decided I can't do this anymore. I can't have another boss. I can't go to work for some, for one more day. And so I quit. And I started this business and went full-time in April of 2020. And we've been going nonstop ever since. And it started as a honeybee management service. So folks might have land, it actually started, our first customers were in the Keswick area, pretty large estates that wanted bees as part of the farm. And either they're only there for part of the year or have no interest in beekeeping or whatever. So I like to joke that we're like the pool boys of beekeeping, because we come in our suits and everybody wants to see the suit, and we take care of the bees, but everything belongs to the landowner. The honey's theirs, the bees are theirs. We just operate the hives. So that's how it started. And of course, the next question was, well, what do we plant for them? And I was like, oh, you should plant this and 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 this. And they're like, okay, how do we do that? And I'm like, well, you do. And they're like, okay, can you do it? And I was like, well, no, but I guess I could. And so we have been slowly building this side of the business of helping people also with wildlife habitat, pollinator habitat, getting wildlife meadows put in. And now all of a sudden I like plant grass for pheasants. You see how these things happen? It's just like, what? Started as a beekeeper, now I'm planting bird grass. But that's just how it goes, and it's great because it's all connected, and we can do everything for everybody and help everybody at the same time. So, yeah, that's sort of my story. And Lake Monticello, does anybody know if you're allowed to keep honeybees here? No. I didn't think so. That's a bummer. And we can talk a little bit about honeybees, some if you want to. So the problem is that we've got thousands and thousands of species of pollinator that live here in the United States, have been native here since before people were on Earth. And honeybees are actually not even native here. They're from Europe. And their sort of native geographic range is Eastern Europe and Africa. They were brought here on wooden ships way back yonder. And they were brought here as livestock, just like cattle. They make honey, they pollinate things, they're super handy livestock. So that's why they're here. And we kind of say that they're naturalized at this point. They're a part of our life, and they're also in trouble too. But they're not the only ones. All these other pollinators, I mean, there's butterflies, there's moths, there's bats, there's beetles, there's native bees that are not honeybees, there's wasps, there's hornets, there's even small mammals can act as pollinators. And did I say bats? Because yes. Yeah, I love bats. So, you know, they have been building a relationship with their sort of host plants for millennia. And then as human population has expanded and development continues to grow, we're fragmenting and segmenting up their natural habitats, their natural pathways, of their natural highways that they move and the places that they normally live. And, you know, we're putting in turf, which, newsflash, nobody eats except like ruminants. We can help by sort of reversing that, and it's pretty easy to do. The loss of habitat is kind of hard to explain the magnitude of the problem. There's lots of fun little models and things online where you can sort of see the historical change. You know, in Virginia, historically, mostly this has been a forest. I mean, we can grow some stuff in Virginia, grass and trees, right? And the trees are the primary landscape here, they were. And you can't build a house in a tree, so, you know, we've been opening it up, and there are some native grasslands in Virginia too. But those tree species are really key here. And it's kind of contrary to what you might be thinking about, because when you're thinking about pollinators and butterflies and things, you might be thinking just about wildflowers and such, but, you know, the tree species are some of the most important species that we have here, and their flowers are really crucial. You know, so the problem is we have habitat loss associated with human development. Next problem is our climate's changing. However, whatever, we're not going to talk about why you think it's changing, but however you think it's changing, and we are warmer earlier than ever before. Less ice, less snow than ever before in recorded human history. So that is impacting insect and plant life cycles, timings. And we'll talk about that more later because the timings can be critical. Third big problem, pesticide use. Everybody hates mosquitoes. I hate ticks. I really hate ticks. I really hate mosquitoes. But the more pesticides we use, the more insects we're accidentally killing. So who cares, right? Why does this matter? Well, it matters because directly, 1/3 of everything you eat directly is pollinated by insects. Indirectly, more than half of everything that you eat has insects in that life cycle analysis of that product. Let me give you 2 examples. Coffee. Do you want to live without it? I don't. Okay, a coffee bean is a seed of a fruit on a tree. Okay, it's called, they call the fruit the cherry. It's kind of like a cherry, and the coffee bean is the pit. And so this tree grows about yay high, it doesn't get too big, has all these beautiful, amazing smelling flowers. Insects must pollinate that flower in order for that seed to grow. Let me take a step back. Also, I'm going to preface everything I say by I'm not a super duper biologist, so I'm really bad at Latin names for things and like proper words for certain cycles. I can explain it to you in layman's terms like nobody else, which is probably more helpful anyways. But I don't know, there's some fancy biological words out there I'm going to skip. There's certain plants that must, for a reason I can't tell you, be pollinated by another flower. So the male part of the flower is the pollen, and the female part being the stamen or pistil, stamen. See? This is what I'm talking about. Male and female, right? Birds and the bees. Okay, the bees are taking the pollen, which is the male genetic material of the plant, and touching it to the female genetic reproductive organs of the plant. Then we have a combination of genetics to make a baby plant, which is a seed. Almost every plant in the world operates this way, but there's all kinds of weird exceptions. But a lot of fruits and nuts and vegetables and the things that we actually eat directly come from this process. And so the plant is relying on the insect to do this for it because it knows it will. And it'll make this delicious, sugary, sweet-smelling stuff called nectar. And the sole purpose of nectar production is to attract insects. So the plant is making this yummy, sweet juice. The insect goes in and drinks that juice, uses it as a carbohydrate source. In so doing, accidentally or on purpose, collects pollen on the plant as well, carries it on to the next flower. Boom, male genetic material is dropped with the female genetic material of the next plant, and the coffee bean starts to grow. Baby coffee tree. So then the farmers take the cherry off and they take the fruit out of it and they dry the seed and then they roast it and then they put it in a bag for you and then we have a really good morning. And it's only because an insect visited that flower that coffee bean exists. So that's a very direct example. Now I'll give an indirect example. A lot of people eat beef. A lot of beef eat a lot of alfalfa. Alfalfa is very similar to clover. Alfalfa seed production requires not only a pollinator, but a specialist pollinator. One species does most of the alfalfa pollination in the United States. So that bee is creating baby alfalfa seeds that farmers plant to grow alfalfa, to harvest, to feed cattle so that you can eat beef, right? You see how it's directly and indirectly, they're always there somewhere in the cycle. So we don't want to lose them because your food web would change entirely. And some of the species are declining at a super scary rate. So wasps and hornets are usually omnivores, so they will eat insects and plants. And the plant material that they're eating is typically nectar, and they're using nectar as a carbohydrate source, and they're using other insects as a protein source. Whereas something like a honeybee is a complete plant eater. It uses flower nectar as its carbohydrate source and pollen as its protein source, because pollen's very protein rich. Carpenter bees, same deal. Nectar and pollen are the protein sources the carbohydrate and protein sources that it feeds itself and its young. The adult bees, honeybees, bumblebees, sweat bees, mason bees, leafcutter bees, yada, 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 bumblebees, they don't have a very high protein requirement, but the babies do. The baby bees have to grow wings and legs and eyes, and so they'll actually bring pollen home to the babies. Yeah, and the wasps aren't very good at pollinating because they're so slick. They don't have all that hair, but they do. They do help a little. Not enough to make me like them. Okay, so we know why it's important. We know why it's happening. What can we do to help? The best thing you can do is plant flowers. It's just that simple. And not just pretty flowers, but plant pretty flowers too. But plant the flowers that are native to your area, that are keystone species. Let me give you a spring and a fall example for right here in your backyard. First thing that's fascinating is, I don't really know a ton about butterflies and moths. I don't really know a ton about bats and beetles and other types of pollinators, but I know a lot about bees. And there's over 400 species of bee in Virginia. Honeybee is one species. Bumblebee is one. Carpenter bee is one. There's 397 more, right? So there's all these bees that you don't even realize exist. And if you really go out and you start looking at your flowers, you're like, what is that? And then you Google it and you have a really hard time identifying it anyways, but you can kind of usually get close to sort of the family of like, what the heck am I looking at right now? What is this thing? Turns out it's a mason bee, or it's a leafcutter bee, or some other cute fuzzy thing. So some cute examples of that. There's a whole family of bee that emerges in early spring. This is going to loop back to this timings thing. A whole species of bee that emerges in early spring, and the only thing it eats is willows. Its whole life. Typically for these 397 others, they live a solitary, quick life. So male bees are born, female bees are born. They mate, the male dies. We didn't need him anyways. After that, the female then goes and collects nectar and pollen and takes it back to some sort of nest, which we'll talk about more later, and provisions that nest with nectar and pollen and lays an egg. And then she does that again, about maybe on average like 20 more times. This is called a solitary bee. It lives a solitary life. She's working by herself. She doesn't have all her sisters in the hive like honeybees do. And she only has like 20 babies, probably most of which will get snapped up by a barn swallow or, whatever. But some of them will survive, right, and do the exact same thing. And typically those bees will overwinter as larvae or in cocoons. And so it's super critically timed annual cycles. The willows bloom, the bees are out. The willows stop blooming, those bees are all dead. The babies are incubating. Next spring, the babies emerge. The willows flower, right? So that's why these timings are so critical, and as our climate shifts, the timing of the willow bloom might change, or this really stressful thing can happen where a host plant, let's say the eastern redbud tree, is calendar dependent, like clockwork. And it's all about sunlight for that tree. And so it kind of blooms April 1st every year. But the blue orchard mason bee, which is the #1 connoisseur of the eastern redbud tree, is temperature dependent because sunlight doesn't touch the cocoons because they're down in some cavity somewhere where the mama laid them. And so when the temperatures get to 55 degrees 5 days in a row, they hatch. Well, February it was like 60 degrees every day. So here we have these mason bees popping out, and guess what? No redbuds, right? So you can see how the shifts in climate are messing up the timings. And so the best thing that we can do, we can't really change that. Hopefully we can. Maybe we can do something about that. We'll see. That's a much bigger conversation. But one thing that we can do is just plant those plants they want, as many of them as they can find, as conveniently as we can get to them. So some really important, keystone species in Virginia: willows, redbuds, tulip poplars, anything in the helianthus, so all the sunflowers, geranium, any of the asters, right? So in the fall, we'll have the same thing. The goldenrods will go. And there's probably 6 species of bee that only eat goldenrod. And they emerge at the same time as goldenrod. Well, we need to make sure they got plenty of goldenrod. And isn't it a bummer when somebody thinks that goldenrod is ragweed, and the mama had laid all the babies over here, and now the ragweed all got killed, and then the babies come out and there's no goldenrod anymore. So, you know, just thinking about things like this and how the things that we do can impact their life cycles. I'll give you another great example, bumblebees. Super fascinating. They live an annual life, but they're kind of social, not quite like honeybees, but kind of like honeybees. They live in small groups. They have a queen. The queen bumblebee starts her year underneath the leaf litter in that wet, you know that wet soil under the leaves? She's sleeping right there. It warms up, she pops out, she finds a nice hay bale in your garage or something, lays some eggs, and those are her workers. They come out and they start working. And then she lays a few more eggs that are going to be new queens. And then she lays a few more eggs that are going to be males. And she lays some more workers. And they kind of have this life cycle over the summer. And then in the fall, I think it's the spring actually. Anyway, I have the timing wrong on this, but the boys mate with the baby queens. And then that queen goes back under the leaf litter and everybody else dies, right? All the workers, all the boys, everybody dies when it gets cold. But the queen is the only one that has the instinct to dig underneath those leaves and get into that wet dirt and go to sleep. So when we burn all of our leaves off, oops. Not that burning's not good. It's Mother Nature's way of letting new things have a chance. But we don't have to burn leaves every year because there could be bumblebee queens in there, right? Same thing, another way you can help is with your gardening techniques. Plant all these flowers, all these great native flowers, plant them, and then leave them alone. Just leave them alone. And they'll go away, like they'll melt. Yeah, it doesn't look very good, but according to who, right? So, you know, I'll give you an example of that. Dog's bane, Indian hemp. It's native here. Everybody hates it. It's poisonous. But it's dog's bane, Indian hemp. It sort of looks like milkweed, but it has a white flower. Very similar leaf. It's also, I think, latexy and gross. Don't let your dogs eat it or your horses. But the pollinators go bonkers over this thing. And it has a pithy stem. That means there's space inside. So once that flower dies and the seeds set and the seeds drop and the stem's still standing, it dries and hollows, and bees will nest inside of that stem. And then you come by with a bush hog. Whoops. So just leave it alone. Next spring, it will dissolve. It will get that black little mildew going in it, and it will get wet, and it will droop, and it will fall. The bees will still emerge in the spring. They're used to that. And your pollinator garden will come back up through it, just like it's naturally designed to do. And then if somebody yells at you about how your stems look in your yard, you tell them that they're bee killers, and that you're not going to clean it up. My neighbors dislike my yard so much. Not sorry. They're like, you know, you should be mowing that once a month. No. My bees are in there. And you can keep bees in Lake Monticello, newsflash. Not honeybees, but you can keep native bees. There's a whole subsect of native bees that nest in cavities. Typically, it will be a beetle borer, a woodpecker hole, termite channels. I mean, a cavity, right? Sometimes it's the spacing in bricks in your house. Somebody forgot a little mortar, right? These cute little cavities exist all over nature. And the bees find the ones that are just the right size for the size of their baby. And they will put like 10, 15 babies in these little cavities. So you can do this artificially. And buy these little tubes. And they'll put 12 little babies down in this tube, one right after the other, cross-section wise. And I got some you can look at, we can pass around. And you can buy them. There's 2 species of bee that you can buy on the internet, and they show up in the mail, and you just let them out. And you have one of these nearby, and they nest in it. And it's super fun. They're super gentle. The only way any of them will sting you is if you squeeze them. You know, they're not defensive at all. And they're so fascinating to watch, and you end up spending a whole day following them around your yard and looking at what they're getting into, and it's really fun. And then over the winter, you just take all these little tubes inside your house, well, depending on the species, and put them in the refrigerator. And then the next spring, you set them out and you get them some new, fresh, clean tubes, very important. And you let the old bees go, and your babies nest in here. And you have this like generations every year of new bees that you're doing. There's 2 really fun species called leafcutter bees. They're native here. And blue orchard mason bee. It's also native here. The blue orchard mason bee in particular is on a sharp decline. Mostly because there's an introduced mason bee that's coming from Asia. Another thing we didn't really talk about, but globalization and pressure of competition, pest and disease is another huge factor in all of this. We bring accidentally on a barge in a shipment of mangoes or something, and now this counterpart to our bee is here, and the equilibrium is completely out of whack, and they just totally overpower. Just like the ailanthus trees, which I know you all know about. If you don't, you should try to kill them. And they just decimate. They over-compete. They out-compete our native bees, and that's a huge reason why the blue orchard mason bee is dwindling. Another reason they're dwindling, they have, just like I was talking about, a super short foraging cycle. The adult females are only foraging for about 3 weeks. Then they die. And they're designed to pop out at the same time as all the fruit trees. So they really love, you know, apricot, apple, plum, cherry, redbud, stuff that's blooming right now. This is their time currently. They're out there. But again, with the shift in timings, they're having a hard time finding something to eat. So, you know, you can buy these bees, set them up in your yard. I hope this is not against any kind of rules. I mean, it shouldn't be. It's totally safe for everyone. And it's really fascinating. And so you'll be obsessed, and you'll like start learning more and more and more, and all of a sudden you'll have all kinds of weird knowledge. The one thing that we need to be really careful about with these insect houses is they have to be cleaned annually. So if you have someone that, there's a real cheap way to do this. There's people that are real wild about this, and they got some crazy systems of how they manage all this, but there's a simple way to do it. Every year, you take everything that's in your bee house, and you put it in a shoebox, and you put it in a cold garage, and you poke a hole in it about yay big. Then you buy all new nesting materials, all new tubes, all new thingies, whatever those are, and then you put fresh in. And then when it turns to good weather like this, you set your shoebox out. Why does this work? They're looking for a cavity, and they will return to the same cavity that they hatched out of, but we don't want them to do that because it could be moldy in there. There's a few diseases in particular that we don't want to perpetuate. Pollen mites, chalk brood, and sac brood. And those are pretty directly related to us bringing in non-native species into the United States, and these are transmissible diseases from bee to bee. So if you let them reuse the same tubes over and over, if it's infected with viral spores, the babies will have it too. So take all that stuff and put it in a shoebox. The bees will see the light coming out of the hole you made, and they will leave. However, when they are like, oh, I just hatched out of here, let me go see what's going on, maybe I can nest in there, That's not a cavity. It's a big shoebox. So they're like, not ideal. And then they move on to your new fresh cavities. And they're like, well, this isn't the one I hatched out of, but this one is perfect, so I'm going to use this. And they make that decision every time. See how that works in their cute little brains that you can override really easily? You gotta remove the cavity from the situation. The best way to do it is put it in a box. And that way you're actually being there's good husbandry there of keeping everything clean and fresh. And yeah, you can just buy the cocoons on the internet. It's really fun. I can give you 2 websites. There's only 2 websites to buy these bees at. Crown Bees is one of them, CROWN, and masonbeesforsale.com. And both of those websites have leafcutter and mason bees available for purchase, and they also have the appropriate nesting materials for each with the appropriate diameter reeds or tubes that you can buy. And they have lots of good educational resources on those bees, including what the heck else is nesting in here, because the most fascinating things end up moving into this thing. It's not just this, like, you're like, what is this? And, you know, pulling it apart and looking at it. So they have all these photo guides, and it's fantastic. In the winter, Thanksgiving, I usually do this. Pull all these tubes out. They're gonna spill everywhere if I do it, but thanks, the microphone. So you take all those tubes out. I'll just pull some, yeah. We'll make a big mess, which I do all the time. Just take the tubes out and put all the tubes in the shoebox and put them in your cold, dark, mouse-free, if you can manage it, because mice are just like, It depends on the species. So the leafcutter bee doesn't want to be refrigerated, but the mason bee does. And this is how you can get like really into the weeds on this stuff and like really become a native beekeeper. But for the sake of everybody, if you just put them into a shoebox into like a cold, dark shed all winter long, and then you pop their shoebox out in the spring and poke that hole, you're good.
So there's going to be bees in there?
Yeah, the bees. I brought some, and I brought two blocks. These are like a little dirty because they're from outside, but I brought this to pass around. I brought 2 of them. Instead of tubes, this is a block. I don't recommend the block because you can't clean the block very easily, but you could take, actually it's fine. You could take the whole block and put the block in the shoebox, right? Put the block in the shoebox. The bees emerge out of these holes. They see the light. They leave the shoebox. They don't come back because the shoebox is not a cavity this small. It is a box, and they're like, that's too big of a space. In here we have probably, I don't know, 1,000 leafcutter bees, maybe 500. It's hard to do this math this quickly. The leafcutter bees are so cute because the mamas build little cocoons for their babies using little cutout pieces of leaf. And what's great about it is they're fantastic pollinators, and the little cuts of leaf that they take are no detriment to the plant. So they're really just like a win-win-win. So they stick their little babies in there, and as I pass this around, can you see how there's like 10 cocoons in each channel? Might be hard to see from that distance, but there's like 10 little cocoons in each channel. And that's each individual baby bee going down. So I can pass that one that way. Let me trade you. Are American species going to Asia and wreaking as much havoc? And the answer is yes. It's just moving. So what happens is lack of natural predators, lack of natural diseases, lack of natural parasites. So I might be totally making this up, but I'll try to explain how this type of thing can happen. The blue orchard mason bee, which is native to the United States, the cardinal loves to eat it as a snack. Well, the blue orchard mason bee is blue. Okay, cardinal's looking for a blue bee. The other one comes in from whatever, the Philippines or something. It's a black bee that has the exact same food sources, the exact same life cycle, is looking for the exact same cavity. So the cardinal's out there eating blue orchard mason bees and not eating a single Osmia from Asia, right? So, or the blue orchard mason bee has reached equilibrium with chalkbrood disease, a fungal infection. And every year, 33% of bees are lost to this fungal infection. Well, it's a totally different fungus, if it exists at all, to the bees on another continent. And so then they come in, this disease maybe has no impact on them whatsoever, or in some cases, it wipes them out completely, right? So the species might come in and an American disease just kills them right away. Or they might come in and they're not affected by this virus and they just explode. So that kind of thing can happen. First off, the answer is that we don't want to lose these. We don't want to lose them. You know, I mean, they're one thing we've discovered is that as soon as we start meddling around with one species and one thing, you pluck this species out, and all of a sudden everything else goes out of whack because the bunnies ate the grass and the bobcats ate the bunnies and the hunters killed the bobcats, and when you remove the bobcats, the bunnies explode, right? So like, and when the bunnies explode, the grass all dies, right? So once you change one thing, it changes everything else. So we don't want to lose these species. Number one, in the name of conservation, they're beautiful. Number two, everything could get messed up. Number three, they might have totally different timings or effectiveness rates of pollination or, you know, target species. You know, they might be like semi-generalists, so they'll eat redbuds and plums and apricots, but they really prefer the redbuds, whereas the non-native bee eats redbuds and plums and apricots, but it really prefers the apricots. And then all of a sudden, the redbud seeds aren't making any seeds. Redbud trees aren't making any leaves because even though the osmia from another thing is visiting them sometimes, our native osmia was visiting them all the time, right? So there's impacts. And it's not to say that we can't reach equilibrium with introduced species, but sometimes things can just go out of whack so quickly. You just want to be really careful about herbicides, fungicides, and pesticides. Typically they do okay with fertilizer because generally you're not like directly spraying a flower with fertilizer. But, you know, my favorite thing to do when I'm spraying anything is to make sure that it's soil applied if possible, and do it at the very end of the day, right before it gets dark, because then it can dry, which if there's anything really sketchy in it for the bees, typically, in a lot of cases, when it dries, it becomes harmless. So carpenter bees, they're really annoying. They're super annoying. And
Those bumblebees, they'll eat a hole through things.
yeah, they will tear your house apart. And they are great pollinators. And I get this phone call all the time. And I'm like, look, I love pollinators, but like, protect your house. Paint it is the number one thing you can do. You can spray it. There's essential oils that repel the carpenter bees. First off, the flower thing is ridiculous. Don't listen to him. But in terms of like, once the bees actually move into your house, that's bad news and you should get rid of them. I have killed carpenter bees before because everything else wasn't working and they were destroying my carport. So kind of got to do what you got to do on that front. Same thing with yellow jackets. They can be really aggressive and nasty, and like, I've killed them before because they're following my kid around, you know, and it's like, no, where's your nest at? So you got to do what you got to do. We want to protect pollinators. Some of them are a real nuisance, and I won't judge you for being like, I love pollinators, I love carpenter bees, and they're so cute, but they were about to tear my deck down, so I sprayed my deck. Like, yeah, of course. I'm not a stink bug person, so I'm sure that the stink bug people are like rolling over right now, but as far as I know, they're just good for getting in the way and being stinky. I don't think, the one that's everywhere, I think is also an introduced species. I'm pretty sure there are native true bugs and stink bugs here, but they're very shy. The ones that are in everything in your house, in your garage, I'm pretty sure, I could be totally wrong about this, but I'm pretty sure they're also from Asia. And they don't have any natural predators. See, this is how like this can happen, is none of our birds want to eat that nasty thing. In Asia, there's a bird that's willing to take one for the team. So, like, don't smash them. I had one living in my car for like, well, until it died. It was like 3 months or something, just because I kept forgetting to take him out, and I didn't want to smash him because I didn't want to be stinky in the car. And so he was just like, walking back and forth across my thing. And I'm like, oh yeah. And then like, you know, he was like right here, and I'm like, I keep forgetting to move you. And then the next day I was like, you haven't moved. And finally it died, and I threw him out the window. Just a bleeding heart. I didn't want to throw him out the window while I was driving, which is so dumb, but it's fine. I don't think they have any pollinator value. I also brought, if anybody just like wants to come up afterwards and play around in this beehive, because that's what we spend most of our day doing. First off, the deer are going to eat just about anything. I find that they just can't eat enough of the black-eyed Susans. So that's a really cheap and easy one that the deer don't seem to devour. Cosmos are pretty good.
Daffodils are good. They don't eat daffodils.
Daffodils are pretty good. Irises. There are, let me get y'all, the deer-resistant seed mix. It's not deer-proof. Yeah, we're only going to be eating tubers and vegetables that self-pollinate. So squash is gone, melons are gone, peppers are gone, tomatoes are gone, all of it. So the reason that it's a pollinator desert is because there's only so many species that can only live. I mean, imagine if your only food was Captain Crunch, right? There's only so many species that can tolerate that, and it's approximately 0. And so the honeybees that come in are brought in. They would not survive in that landscape for long, because when you have a monocrop, and I understand there's a lot of people to feed, you know, I want y'all to know that I'm not on a soapbox about much except help pollinators. We got these huge, tens of thousands of acre swaths of one variety of almond tree that flowers exactly in the same moment. And they're actually actively working against everything else because everything else is a weed competing with that tree. And so that bloom is only about 15 days long. After that, there's not a single flower in that whole 10,000 acres. And so the lack of food diversity is the problem. That's why it's a pollinator desert, is because no one has anything to eat there except for during those 2 weeks. And then what do? We truck in hundreds of thousands of honeybee colonies. So then not only did they not want to live there anyway because there was nothing else to eat besides almonds for 2 weeks, they can't even get a word in edgewise because we just cram so many honeybees into that space to do the job, and then we truck the honeybees out and off they go. And traveling pollination is really cool, and it's a really fascinating industry. So 1/2 of the country's entire honeybee population is in California. I think they might be done. I think the bloom might be over. I can't remember. I'm pretty sure it's late February. And then a lot of them will go up to like North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, and they'll hit all of that alfalfa and yellow sweet clover. Center pivot irrigated, and you're in the airplane and you see the big circles. They're growing a ton of food for cows and seed for food for cows. And so the bees all then go there to pollinate that to make seed for food for cows. And then they can only live up there, by the way, in the summer, because I don't know how people live up there in the winter, but whatever. Then they get trucked down to Florida to do orange blossom. See, so there's these beekeepers that just... And strawberries.
The same bees?
Same hive. Typically, the queen would be the same, but all the rest of the honeybees, the adult honeybees perish about 6 to 8 weeks of old age. So, blueberries, it's another big one. Here in Virginia, the only real pollination events that we have are all the apples and stuff out west, and a little bit of pumpkins and melons, but for the most part, it's not. If the you-know-what hits the fan, we're still going to have wine. Because the grapes don't need insect pollinators. They're what's called a perfect flower, and they're self-pollinated. So they're one of the few fruits that do not need them at all. There's got to be some low growing, I'm thinking, so straight off, I'm thinking like phlox is like a low grower, and hanging baskets. Strawberries. I don't think that the sweet potatoes, the ornamental sweet potatoes, don't do a flower. I don't think. Some small, quick, shallow-rooted plants, and you could just kind of keep a rotation going. Yeah, that's a good point. I'm going to make some like hanging basket lists. Bees love all herb flowers pretty much. So basil, thyme, rosemary, any mint, they love it. One of my favorites is Tulsi. It's a holy basil, and it is so good, and it makes the best tea, and it just really helps you like chill out, and the bees go bonkers for it. It's good stuff. Tulsi, Tulsi. One of my favorite things to do is plant trees, because like I was saying, the tree bloom in Virginia is what most of our keystone species are specialists that only eat such and such. It's usually trees. So I'll send y'all that list of the native specialist. So it's a little thick because it's scientific, but at the bottom of the article, there's a table, and it's online, and there's links to click. And on the left side is all of the bees species, but then on the right side is all of their specialist plant. And I am like, this is too many bee species, and it's all in Latin names, and I don't understand what's going on. So I just run down, and I'm like, oh, yep, the vitex and the willow comes up again and again, and the asters come up again and again, and so it's like, these are the ones. Redbud comes up again and again. And those are the ones that I target. So you could just run down that list and say, dang, this one showed up 17 times. There's 17 bees that only eat this. I'm going to plant some of that. So that's a good list I'll send you. We have keystone species, meaning really important bee species that are solely responsible for the perpetuation of willows. And so without those species, we would have a really hard time. Granted, we're doing really well with grafting and ornamental plant work and blah, blah, blah. But before we were doing all of that, the willow would not have perpetuated without its keystone bee species. So you can really kind of target those species and do your best to keep them going by giving them what it is they're looking for. A lot of the ornamental hybrids provide almost no value to pollinators. The eastern redbud is our native redbud. It's the one on the side of the road. And you can also go to a nursery and get this beautiful redbud that also has red leaves. That thing has been like overbred, and they're breeding it and grafting it and changing it for red leaves, not for quality of forage provided to pollinators. And so they kind of lose all that stuff. And typically when you're breeding for one trait, the other traits get weaker. And the eastern redbud, which you can get real cheap, bare root, just order some 4-foot redbud trees. It's one of my favorites. I love it so much. Just order it online. You'll get like 10 in a box. It'll be like $80. And go stick those things out there on the wood's edge. That will grow well here. It's a legume. It's so pretty. And so many bee species are obsessed with it. We talked about specialist species. I only eat willows. I only eat goldenrod. I only eat purple whatever so-and-so's aster. The generalists, honeybees, bumblebees, a lot of sweat bees, mason bees to an extent, leafcutter bees to an extent, they love dandelions. It's always on the menu. And so, clover. Clover's another good one. Just kill your grass and plant clover. It's green from a distance. No one will know. And just, let it flower, and then the flowers go brown, and you mow it, and it flowers again. And it's really high quality forage for the bees. And it's soft underfoot. It's like a win-win for everybody. There is cultural value to turf. I have a lawn. My kid plays soccer in it, right? So it's important to make sure that you're checking your boxes. But in a space that nobody is using, I want to kill every blade of grass I can find and put flowers there instead. And so I would go full rate clover. Crimson clover is a really cheap actual annual clover. Most clovers are perennial. And actually, they're super perennial, and you'll plant them and you'll be really disappointed because nothing will happen for like 18 months. And you're like, I spent so much money on that seed. And then you forget. And then like the next summer, oh my gosh, look at all this clover. So it's slow. But the annual crimson clover, I'm all about instant gratification. I'm a super impatient person. I need flowers now. And so the crimson clover is really cheap. You can go to southern states and say, give me a 10-pound sack of crimson clover and just go till up some dirt and throw it in there. It's beautiful. The bees love it. It brings nitrogen into your soil. Once it's done flowering, you can turn it over. There will be some volunteers next year, but not quite as many. You can buy clover seed online. A lot of people here plant ladino. That's the most common one. The bees prefer the red clovers, but they're very hard to grow. Think about how many white clovers you see in your day, and then think about how many purple clovers you see in your day. And that's because the red clovers are not as successful here. And so you have to work a little harder and be willing to accept money loss of seed with red clover, but the pollinators really do prefer it. So if you can get some going, that's good stuff. So monarchs are milkweed specialists, right? So now we've been talking about specialists and we know what's going on with that. So monarchs require milkweed for nesting. Butterflies are really good in general, and sometimes they're much better than bees because they have such a long proboscis. So there's some flowers specifically designed for butterflies and hummingbirds only, because the bee tongue is so short. Like honeysuckle, most of which is not native here, the honeybees can't get into that flower. It probably is maddening to smell that sweet, sweet nectar and not be able to eat it. But the flower, think about the shape of the flower. It's too, but the butterflies can. I have like all kinds of fun stuff up here for y'all to look at and talk about, and I'll be here for a few minutes. Okay.
Thank you very much, Allison. That was really helpful. And I do want to just mention briefly that the Lake Monticello Wildlife Committee is sponsoring a project to gain community certification from the National Wildlife Federation. We need 175 individual properties signed up, and so far we have about 80. So I'm encouraging everybody to please look into this, acquire an application so you can get your property certified. And you can get the applications online, or we have paper applications we can give you. But I just want to encourage you all to do that. Okay, thank you so much for coming.
Yes.